Testing.
Thank you.
Is that loud enough?
Yeah. Okay. Live chat is on for live feed is on.
Anything before I stop? Dylan, Roland is awesome, and Aaron is back there too. They know basically everything I do. And if anything, just let them know.
Thank you so much.
Basement, and you'll see the black chairs right there, so you can use them.
Notice you shared it to. Okay.
This will be the last question.
What do you think? Should we?
Yeah, we should probably answer. I'm trying to make a post for it,
Are you guys set? Ready to go? Okay. Good evening. My name is Vladimir Kristich. I am Academic Director of Kansas City Design Center, and I want to thank you for being here, for your time and contribution to the project. I think most of you are familiar with the Kansas City Design Center, but just in case you're not, Kansas City Design Center is an academic program supported by and being part of K-State and University of Kansas. Our commitment is to engage on urban design projects that are relevant to the community. And the fundamental aspect of our projects is they are really generated through community input and feedback. We are not strangers to this area. KCDC over the last 7 years has done 4 different projects in the area. We did a study for Independence Avenue. We did a study for Scattered Renaissance infill housing. A previous study for Kessler Park. And we are now engaged in this project. In 2014 and 15, we've done, in collaboration with Parks and Rec, the first study for Kessler Park and the Reservoir. And then subsequent to that, the community has approached us about 2 years ago, suggesting that there was a need to take a second look at the reservoir and see if we can push further the design ideas and work with the city and the community to bring it closer to the possibility of transformation and conversion for use that would benefit the community itself. Subsequent to that, we have applied to we have received the grant, and we are also working in collaboration with Parks and Rec on executing this project. The purpose of our project is always, as I said before, to be collaborative. Maybe some of you may be familiar with the fact that Parks and Rec just issued an RFP for master plan for Kessler Park, and we will be working with them, exchanging the findings and outcomes of this project and trying to connect that also to the study that's going to be ongoing. We're trying to be as comprehensive as possible in that regard. And so obviously the purpose tonight is to get your feedback and input. I'd just like to explain what's the stage of the project. At this point, we have not gotten yet into programming, thinking about what should be put in the reservoir. This is what we need your feedback and input for. This is preliminary study. We're looking at some possibilities of just physical transformation of the reservoir and its integration and better connection with the park as a starting point to think about what else it can be. So in that regard, your input and feedback as we talk about the possibilities of what can go in the reservoir and how further actually the immediate surrounding and part of the park that's part of the reservoir can be further kind of envisioned is really critical. So with that, again, I want to thank you for your feedback and input. I'll turn it over to Mariah, our project coordinator, to say a few words about scheduling and what's ahead of us for the next couple of months, and then students will make the presentation. Thank you.
Hi guys, thank you for coming tonight. So as you know, we've kind of been spreading information about the community engagement via social media and been sharing it at neighborhood association meetings when we can. So we're going to be nearing the end of the semester in December, so we're going to have an open house, probably, hopefully, on site, where we will invite everyone again to kind of see the culmination of the semester's work. But starting in January, we're going to kick off the second semester, and there will be 3 more community meetings as the project continues to develop. So if you're interested in continuing to kind of keep up with the project and see how it's going, keep an eye on our social media, keep an eye on PH's website and their Facebook because they've been sharing it, and we'll make sure to get the word out to you guys. But feel free to email us too if you have any questions. Reach out to us on Instagram. I run all the social media, so I can help however I can. Thanks for coming.
So good evening, my name is Donovan Douglas, and I'm a student with the Kansas City Design Center. We'd like to thank you again for coming and offering any sort of feedback that you have. So my name is Donovan Douglas, and this is my compatriot.
I'm Jonathan Ludwig. Thank you guys for coming.
And so this is Reinventing Kessler Park Reservoir. Talking about the timeline, Mariah just mentioned it, but this is our second public meeting in November. We'll have open house in December, and then we'll further this project next year in the spring semester. Today, we generally are going to have a presentation that we're giving right now, talking about what we're doing, a general overview presentation, and then after that, we would ask if you could offer some feedback about our different investigations into how the reservoir is being transformed. And that will be in these 3 separate groups that you can see in this space and then 2 spaces over in the gallery.
Before we started designing the reservoir, we wanted to figure out our goals and objectives that we want to accomplish through the design. So when looking at the goals, we had 2 main goals, and that was the reconnecting Kessler Park to the rest of the city at both the neighborhood and the regional level. And the way we wanted to do that was to emphasize the north-south corridor using Wabash, provide better public transportation to the site, and then improve walking and biking connections also to the site. And then our second goal was to establish Kessler Park as a regional destination. And the way we want to do that is integrate, intersect, and preserve the reservoir, which we will discuss later in these 3 groups. And then also provide unique programs, which is what we're wanting your guys' input on tonight. And then preserve the functions and current characteristics of the reservoir, for instance, like the graffiti wall, as it's a very popular part of the site.
As we understood Kessler Park, we understood that Kessler Park was relevant at several different scales. And in this section, we're going to talk about the scale of relevance, the concept that we have at that scale, and then subsequently the evidence that we have developing that concept. So the first scale that we understood was the regional scale. And this is all of Kansas City inside the 435 loop, and how Kessler interacts with the rest of the city in that way. Based upon that, we developed a concept that we think that Paseo and Prospect could be dramatic corridors for bringing people to and from Kessler Park. Currently, it's not a great way of getting to and from Kessler Park, and so we want to help reinforce that. As part of that analysis and developing that concept, we found these 4 main maps. We had a very extensive analysis phase of understanding the park and the rest of the city, and these are just 4 of among about 150 diagrams and maps understanding how the park works. Amenities, we want to understand what parks had amenities and what different parks were in the city. We wanted to understand the time it took to drive places to and from Kessler Park, and then finally, we want to understand these significant corridors in the area.
Then we started looking at the East Bottom neighborhood, which consists of downtown Kessler Park and then the East Bottom, which is showing the river there. And so looking at our concept, we understood that Independence and St. John were 2 east-west corridors that were bringing people from outside of the community to the site. And we also looked at how, like Donovan had stated, Paseo and Prospect coming up from the south, and then there's a connection to East Bottom that we'd like to investigate. What brought us to that conclusion was looking at the corridors and also the bus transportation stops, and also where walking and trails are to the site and the surrounding city. And again, looking at those 2 main routes, and then looking at Wabash as our main entry to the site.
Subsequently, the next scale we wanted to look at was the Kessler Park scale. And this included all of Kessler Park along its duration and the adjacent neighborhoods. We want to understand how it was interacting with those neighborhoods adjacent to it. By basing off of that, we understood that, again, Paseo and Prospect are primary avenues, but also Wabash could become a very important aspect into that. And we also wanted to understand how Independence and St. John are significant east-west collector streets. That we took from various diagrams explaining this, but generally that was what we understood We also did a analysis of understanding what activities are in this area. What could the reservoir use? What could you guys need, or something that could be better to better the area and better the park?
Then we started looking at the reservoir scale.
Sorry.
No, that's cool. Reservoir scale. And then this consists of the reservoir, and then again zooming in closer with the surrounding neighborhoods. And so looking at this, we found that we found like popular areas within the site, and also this main axis of Wabash. Now, one thing we were proposing, we will discuss later in the master plan, is we were going to turn Wabash into a one-way street and taking parking and driving out of the reservoir, and we'll discuss that later in the master plan.
Out of the reservoir, more importantly, out of the park in the area. So currently that drive, people drive around, you can drive around in the park. We're proposing that you stop cars at the entry, you park, you get out of your car, you use the park more as a walking trail or a biking trail, things like that.
Yeah, and then we started looking at what kind of recreational activities are happening near the reservoir within that site. Also, again, looking at Wabash and the connections that it's having with those east-west collector streets that we discussed earlier, and also looking at these different like important parts like the pond and overlook, and also disc golf is a very popular pull to the site.
Finally, the immediate context scale was this general area of Kessler Park, in which, or right around the reservoir, you can understand that that part of the park is pretty important, and it's very, very much informed by how the reservoir interacts with it. So here we broke our rules a little bit. Instead of having a concept for this right now, more generalized, we have concepts that during our three concepts, this would be the scale that we generally start to adjust based off of those. But these maps helped inform us. We wanted to understand what the areas of desirable uses were, what the areas of undesirable uses were, what the areas of water collection and water runoff. We did the math. We helped find out where that water was going and how we could help better integrate that in the park. We also understood that there were significant rooms in the area, or what we're calling rooms. They're perceived spaces where if you're down in a bowl, you can understand that you have a general understanding and experience of that space that's different than another part of the park. And that was defined by foliage and topography and roads and things like that.
And then once we found out what's happening on the outside of the reservoir, we started looking at what's going on within the reservoir. And so here we can kind of see the geometry, just kind of understand the reservoir, and we can see what it looks like compared to the two basins versus just one basin cross section. And then we can also see on the next slide the scale of the reservoir. And so we started comparing the scale to other important spaces within the city. And so, like over here, we can see Arrowhead and Kaufman, and that reservoir they're at the same scale, so you can understand that we have a very large space to work with. And then up above, you can see just a football field. So just that helps understand the scale of the build. And then within that geometry, we see that materiality has changed between brick and concrete. And then this is showing what the materiality has broken and why it's in this disrepair it is at today, and how we're going to further use that in our concepts later on. Here we looked at the sound, and so the thing on the image on the left is showing East Bottoms and the decibels from the factory and the industrial area, and how that is interacting with the reservoir. And over here we can see kind of just activities and sound, just normal every day. And then also see the sound of traffic from the Chestnut trafficway into the reservoir. And then we looked at foliage and kind of where these plant life has brought itself in through these cracks of the reservoir we discussed earlier. And we see that a lot of it is around the perimeter, and which still has just little pockets within the site. And there's images here which you can just kind of understand what the reservoir looks like in its condition today.
And just this week, we also were investigating what trees in the reservoir were invasive species, what trees we don't want. If we were to keep the foliage in the reservoir, what do we want to get rid of? What do we want to keep? We want to understand that so we can understand what we want to keep, what we want to get rid of in that way.
And then here we're looking at what is the sun and shadows like on the winter and summer solstice. The one on the left is what the reservoir is looking like today with its foliage. And the image on the right is showing what the reservoir was supposed to look like in its original use without any foliage. And then here, as I stated earlier, graffiti is a very important thing at the reservoir. And so on the left, we started looking at very important, like higher areas of graffiti, and then it has it dispersed out as that turquoise area. And we also looked at activities and like what time people visit the reservoir. And so blue is like evening visits, the orange is afternoon, and then the yellow spots around are like in the morning. So we just wanted to see what time people came and what spot from the reservoir.
After we understood a general analysis of the area, we conducted several precedent studies to understand different areas around the world of what happens in urban spaces and how urban spaces can be created.
First one we looked at was repurposing, which is having like the reservoir just a unused space. So there's three main things you can do to that. You can preserve it, which is you don't mess with it at all. You leave it as its original condition. Infill it is you use the previous structure or like kind of bones of the design, and then infill a new activity or program into it. And then removal is just taking parts of the old existing and making a completely new kind of design.
Among the other ones, another way of creating urban space is green infrastructure, where you want to either environmentally manage different characteristics of an area, or you can restore the natural environment. So if you have an issue that you encounter where there isn't enough water coming through, you can restore that via green infrastructure. Furthermore, contemporary spaces yields a understanding of dynamic spaces and static spaces, in which there's temporary urban spaces and permanent urban spaces, where in a permanent urban space, you have a more static space it's more defined, whereas as a dynamic space, things may be more temporary. The building may be temporary, the structure may be removed shortly after it was installed, or it's a temporary installation rather than a permanent fixture of the community.
Then we started looking at the overall findings that we found, and we started seeing issues and then we started looking at how do we solve that within these solutions. And so we found that adapting existing infrastructure can redefine the purpose of the space, and we looked at green infrastructure and how we can make the space more sustainable, and then we also found that permanent temporary program can engage users in a different way within the space. And then we started looking at programming analysis, which will consist of ULI recommendation, which stands for
Urban Land Institute. They're a nonprofit organization that helps to study various urban conditions in the country and offer recommendations based upon those.
Right. So then looking at the goals and what ULI is about, we understand that they help make decisions based on urbanization, demographics, population change, economic, technology, and environmental concerns. And then when they they take those aspects and then they start advising people on how to enhance each kind of property that they're working with.
So what did they find about Kansas City? They found that there was some economic opportunity that could be improved. There's rising rent, there's tightening vacancies, there's things that could be improved with the economic situation in Kansas City. Furthermore, there's some concentrated poverty where there was some racial redlining that occurred, and placing boulevards in the city, there's a very clear dividing line between races, and they were noting that is a difference, and that's something that has to be taken into account. Furthermore, it also meant that white flight, where people would leave previous communities and end up in different communities because of one reason or another, because of this redlining.
And so the main recommendation is that ULI has for the Kansas City area is leverage Parks Boulevard system to address inequality And so that's kind of what we're going to be focusing on, is using the park to take away that barrier between the races.
There's the next element that we investigated was programmatic relationships. We wanted to understand that generally there's scales, there's permanent versus temporary, unique factors, function, and approach to existing site. We developed this matrix to help us understand how things interacted with each other, and based off of those, we came up with constellations to help understand the relationships between one thing and another. When you have open green space, you need something else. When you have on-street parking, it creates something else. We wanted to understand how those relationships worked. So permanent versus temporary, if you're designing restrooms, then those help, restrooms help on-street events, art installations, and sport events happen, for instance. Furthermore, unique program considerations. These are programs that are unique in the city and with parks in general. So disc golf is among them, walking events, concert halls, and understanding where things connected one to another help us understand how making one thing means you have to help develop another thing. It's a complex web where you pull one string and all the strings come with it.
Then we started looking at a master plan that will be the base of all of our concepts that we will discuss later. And
Yeah.
so, what was that?
Unfortunately, we don't have a full plan that's developed where you can see all of them all at the same time, and that was a mistake on our part. What you can see is elements behind the gentleman in the back, where there's on the countertop among the windows, you can see what we're thinking about with Wabash, how we're thinking about developing wetlands, and also parking in the area.
So the image on the top is showing the wetland that we are acknowledging that runoff for. And so this was our proposal to deal with that. And then, as I stated earlier, we will be taking out driving and parking in the park. And so we're proposing a parking lot around the site. And then the next slide is showing our proposal of what Wabash will become. We propose opening up the street a lot more, adding a lot more green along around the road. And each image here is showing a block of what we're proposing. And then we're talking about how the traffic will go near Cliff Drive or return off of Prospect.
So that brings us to conceptual formal studies, and that's what those three things I brought up earlier are, and that's what we're hoping to get some of your feedback on along with program today. We developed three main ideas. We have integration, where we're removing parts of the reservoir, which seems dramatic, I know, but what it helps do is it helps to reorganize and reorder the park. It means that you can help use the reservoir as part of the park to help reorganize different things. We have two main studies of that so far, where we've found that these two main studies were the more successful options, the south cut and an east cut.
Then we looked at intersecting, which is similar to the integration part, except it's more of a linear aspect of doing it, where we cut through the reservoir and connect both sides. And so the reservoir remains its specific, original space, but it's merging the whole park to work as one.
If you understand the reservoir as its own space, by cutting through it and cutting into it, we can use the reservoir as a way to interact with the rest of the park by doing this scheme. We're dissolving it a little bit.
And then here we can see on the left, you can see the site plan of what we'll discuss later with the groups, but why we made our cuts. And then here are just some images of what these cuts would look like. So on the top is an overall cutting through the reservoir. The second one is where the entries are as we enter from the park to the reservoir. And then the last one is showing what happens when you're inside the reservoir.
And then the final one was what we call preservation. It's the least invasive option. You say, let's keep the reservoir as it is, and instead let's use that space to create something new inside of it. And how can we bring circulation into the reservoir so that the reservoir remains as it is currently? And so there's two main options with that. There's slipping in and a more formal entry. As we understand it right now, they're just conceptual and more formal investigations. We don't know what's going in there yet. That's what we'd like to help develop today. So that's the first phase of this of today. Are there any questions that anyone would have to help enlighten anything of what we're doing or looking at?
Sure.
All right. Start from the beginning. By the way, I live right across the street from Reservoir, and I'm also an architect. So I don't know which hat to wear necessarily, community or design. But you mentioned early on about the Paseo as a main entry point, and then also Prospect. And then as we got to the more local, then you start talking more about Wabash. And so I'm a little confused on the reconciliation of those two. And then I was happy to see the parking lot actually in the later on, because I kind of perceive Prospect as more of a gateway entry, and because Wabash is really tight, at least vehicle-wise, and selfishly I would discourage parking along Wabash. And then, the current drive handles parking really well right now, because whenever they have Frisbee tournaments, there's a ton of cars out there, and it doesn't impact the community, which I really enjoy. But then I also like the idea of getting rid of the drive, because my biggest complaint about the Reservoir is I just hear gunshots at night all the time. People will shoot it, and they're driving in a car, and they just shoot off into the woods or something. I don't know where they shoot. And then I hear them speed off, and they do the exact same thing, all the time. And so I don't know if that would deter people from doing that, but that's the thing I hate the most about what happens now there. But it does concern me by not having, I love the Frisbee golfers because they occupy the space, so by being in the space, you make it safer. So I don't want to discourage people, existing in space either, because it's a big park. So I just want to make sure people still have good access, because there's different types of people that use the space. I love doing the hiking trails and all that, but then there's others that just park and sit there all day long. I don't know. So anyways, that's one, just the access thing, and I question the Wabash idea, I guess, and wonder why it's not more Prospect, given what we saw.
Addressing that first point, we understood that Independence is that east-west collector street. And so Prospect and Paseo bring you closer to Independence, and that was perhaps a bit unclear in the presentation. And once you hit Independence, Wabash is an easier way to come up to the Reservoir, what we understood, because by converting it into a one-way, we can have a very clear gateway into the Reservoir. Wabash can become more celebrated.
Are you talking about vehicular?
Right.
So we were thinking of having Wabash as a one-way up to that curve right at the site. And the reason we haven't talked about Prospect with some of those streets is we've noticed that Independence, I don't think any streets continue through. Every street jogs somehow. So that was just another reason why we just thought that Wabash was centered between the two streets that were that were coming up through the site. So they didn't go through all the way. So that's why I just talked about that.
Again, I just say that the community would probably say that Wabash is not a vehicular, gateway. That I would rather, I see Prospect as more of the, more friendly to vehicles than Wabash, because it's, you have to pull over to let another car drive by.
Well, so that's a great point, and so probably to further clarify, that's what we can work on. We can think more about Wabash as a pedestrian access, and more like a pedestrian-oriented promenade, and that the Prospect would be more vehicle-oriented, especially because in this scheme, we see that Prospect would terminate in parking lot.
Right.
That takes you to, so I think that's important. I appreciate that, David. That's great, yeah.
I also think to the Wabash point, there's Garfield Elementary School there, and so the buses, if you turn that into a one-way, that would be probably problematic for them because they come up Prospect, turn onto Amy, and then turn to go south onto Wabash. So that would be another consideration. But I like the thought of making it very pedestrian friendly because right now no one cares that there are elementary school students there, so traffic calming on Prospect and Wabash would be nice. And I also, with that, I think we've all talked about a roundabout at the end of Prospect at Lexington, which I think would help filter into
parking, if that did exist, and help kind of transition, but also slow traffic down, because that's a huge, huge problem.
Thank you very much for that feedback.
So, go ahead, please.
Oh, different question. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on how to preserve the reservoir as a space for free art, or like being free in art. And I mean, you mentioned graffiti as being like a big part of the space, and I just want to know, how do you prevent vandalism and preserve art?
Well, I think most of our concepts have kept that central wall, so we still allow, or in our design, again, we haven't thought about program yet, so we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the space, but I think most designs keep some kind of wall space to continue that part for the community.
So, it is, so go ahead.
No, I was curious, I was a little distracted. Did you already talk about the, part of this is the National Endowment for the Arts grant?
Right.
Okay.
So we actually, as we continue, Corey Imig, who is an artist in the community, we have an advisory group that works with us, and as we move, we want to make sure that involve more artists in design thinking about this. And the issue of vandalism versus preservation is also, I think, central to some of our consideration. Is it better to preserve and insulate the reservoir so it remains as a kind of integral space, because that also makes it invisible and difficult to kind of supervise, as opposed to being able to cut into it and kind of create some kind of more public access into it. In which case you will still not displace the art functions of it, but you will make it more present and more integrated into park, in that sense, maybe even be able to prevent some of the vandalism that might be happening otherwise. We don't have a solution for that, but that's really one of the discussions we want to have with you, with these three different ideas of preserving, intersecting, removing sides of the reservoir to see how that works. The premise of that is this, that reservoir is not going to ever be restored to its original function. It's not going to hold the water anymore. It has its own significance as an object and as a space in the park, but at this point it's really totally disconnected from the park. So the question is here, how far we can go in transforming it, integrating it into the park, and that's really the discussion we want to have with you and have feedback and input on those things. The last thing I want to ask you, and that's really, we had a couple of different discussions about the traffic through the Kessler, so that part of Kessler Park, because we found out that parking is one of the problems, because that's really where undesired behavior takes place. You guys also know that there's some, they're doing the burnouts and some of those things. So the question is, in keeping with the original idea of Kessler Park, it can be freed of traffic other than service traffic, but at the same time provided connection to the cliff drive, which is part of the original Kessler plan. Would it make sense actually to eliminate this kind of loop traffic through the park and keep it more to the front part of the park? Go ahead.
Well, I think to respond to that, Cliff Drive is currently inaccessible to vehicles at all.
Right.
So I guess a question related to that point is the goal to reopen Cliff Drive as an access point? You mentioned Paseo as a gateway and Wabash as an exit. And in addition to that, if you're talking about constructing a parking lot, why even bother talking about the possibility of a single entry and exit point? And why not just eliminate driving around the park entirely?
Great question.
It's a good question. Part of what is difficult about Cliff Drive is it is among the national
It's a scenic byway.
Scenic byway. Thank you, sir. Where it's something that we have to preserve access to. It's, I believe, the only urban scenic byway in the nation.
The longest.
I'm sorry.
Okay,
It's the longest.
Or it's the longest. Okay. And so there's a limit to how much we can interfere with it and how much access we can interfere with it.
But that's something that we can further look into based on your feedback and input and direction.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying currently it's not even accessible to vehicles.
Right.
I mean, it's blocked, it's barricaded on both sides, and actually there's another entrance from Kessler.
Right.
So I think many people use Cliff Drive as a traffic-free space for exercise and recreation. So I definitely think that there would be some concerns around the loss of that area, unless, I mean, maybe if it's protected, that would be, as long as it's protected past the Kessler exit, that could still be a valuable space. But right now, that's what people seem to use it for the most.
So I don't know if there are any other comments. If they're not, we really would, these 3 different studies for how to transform the reservoir, the actual subject of our discussion tonight. So if there are not any general questions, I'd really ask you and encourage you if you could. There's one group here and 2 groups in the other adjacent rooms. So if you guys could spend a few minutes providing your feedback and input, we'd appreciate it.
I don't know if it's up somewhere, but could you go back to the rendering that shows the size of the reservoir in relation to other structures?
About midway. Right there.
And also, before you guys kind of break out into separate groups, there are some QR codes laying around on tables and in the other room. So if you want to provide written feedback as well, or otherwise, feel free. You can leave more detailed answers that way as well.
And then the groups are intersecting is here, and then integration and preservation is in the back.
Yes.
Vladimir, I know you mentioned that you didn't put programming in here, but a lot of people are always thinking, well, how is it going to be used?
Right.
What type of activities are going to take place? And that'll determine, of course, how you develop the space. So you've kind of developed different concepts for the space without any thought of the use. So when does the use of that space come into play?
So that's the discussion for today. We need your feedback
Okay.
and input. Because we certainly would not like to program anything without community feedback. But we thought that it was necessary to envision the physical possibility, physical transformation as a starting point. But this is also tied to the specificity of the program. And from this point on, we want to have discussion about programming and further developing, and also taking your feedback and input in terms of the physical transformation that we envision as possible for the reservoir itself.
Okay.
One final point before we break off as well. We keep saying, oh, one more thing. This is a vision study. We're not proposing this is happening tomorrow. We would like to see it happen eventually, but the Parks and Rec wanted a development and a vision for Kessler Park. And so we're helping to envision what could happen here, but this is not something that's imminent. We're not blowing up anything or doing anything yet.
To that point, because sometimes you say park, sometimes you say Kessler Park. Is this more Is it more expansive than the reservoir? Is it really meant
It's
to
more
just be
contained
more?
along that final scale, which I am going on there. This is more of the scale we are looking at our intervention for.
That's the scope of the project.
Yeah.
And we will, obviously, we know that the community need, there's the group decided to check, they're looking at the pond. We will be meeting with them, looking how the improvement of the pond can be further integrated with this, but this is the actual scale. So the Kessler Park, we need to kind of qualify. Thanks for the question. It's the reservoir and the surrounding area that we're looking at. So before we move on, because is there any major critique? Do you see any issues with the direction that you're taking to think about refocusing the reservoir that we might be headed in the wrong direction that we can make a objection with?
I guess one observation is you didn't include infill, which I think the previous studio did more of that idea, and I like where you're heading, where it's more of an intervention than an extra.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yep. Great. Thanks. So if there are no,
There's one more question.
what is?
I'm going to say something too.
So we'll pin these papers up in the back. But these are options of the program, like you were asking earlier. And we'd like your guys' feedback, like put stickers if you like or don't like. We'll have stickers by them, just so we can get your guys' feedback on the different types of programs. We'll have it pinned up in the back.
I have a quick question about the decibels, how you all measured that. That in the 2014-2015 study, people were really concerned about whatever does get programmed there, the noise. So how did you all measure that? Because that was super fascinating.
That's Rebecca's question. Rebecca.
So for the surrounding environment, we took just kind of average between a typical street, a typical highway, and just a typical industrial environment, especially for the east bottoms at the top. Specific to the reservoir, we took an app that measures the sound decibel for the surrounding area as well as within.
Okay.
Well, so if there are no other questions, thank you once again. And I also want to make sure that we thank Eric and PH Coffee for hosting this, and I really appreciate it very much. So thank you.